Oh, sorry, a bit of a problem with the sound there, my fault. I'll start again. Hello, my name's David Van Kesteren, and I am the Senior Asset Management Engineer in System Planning, and I'm joined today by Kaza Malik, who is the Design Engineer in the EHV Connections Design team. So thanks, Kaza, for doing this presentation with me today.
Thank you.
I'm just going to take you through the format for what we're going to do today. We've got a presentation for you. It should take about 30 minutes. The slides are not... Oh, here we go. Right, okay. For that 30-minute duration, you'll be in listening mode only. But during the presentation, we've got a couple of little polls for you at the beginning, at the end. But there's also the question bar. And if you want to ask us any questions, please just fill them in as you go. We'll be able to see them popping up at this end. And if we see the opportunity to answer the question as we're going through, we will do. Otherwise, we will deal with the questions at the end of the presentation. Also, either during or at the end of the presentation, if there's any feedback you want to give to us directly, then you can email our ICE coordinator, which is Emma Wilson, and the email address is there, ice@northernpowergrid.com. Okay, so moving on, the content for today. We're going to fly through, starting really with what is the Statement of Works. Hopefully you've got an idea, but if you don't, we're going to talk you through it. The historical process and what's called Appendix G, which I'll come on to later, which is a new process, relatively speaking. We're going to talk about some updates in terms of changing those processes from the historical to the newer versions. Going to give you an update on where we are with Statement of Works within our area, the general outcomes that we've seen coming out of that, and some of the solutions that we're working with National Grid to resolve. And then next steps, and finally an open question and answer session, which we've got about 30 minutes to use. So we'll start with a quick poll. Just like you, if you could please, to give us a bit of a clue as to what we've got in the audience. Tell us where you stand in terms of your knowledge on Statement of Works. So we're really looking for, you've heard of Statement of Works, but you don't really know much about it, or whether you've been through the process at some stage in the past, not necessarily with Northern Powergrid, because the process should be very similar in all network operators, or maybe you've got quite a bit of experience and you've been through the Appendix G process as well, which we're going to talk about. But again, may not be with Northern Powergrid. So if you're able to choose which category you're in, that would be good. And we'll give you the feedback on that in a couple of minutes. In the meantime, we'll keep moving. So I'm going to start by talking a little bit about the Statement of Works process as it is at the moment. So what is a Statement of Works? It's a formal statement that we get from National Grid stating whether any new relevant generation that's trying to connect to our network has a significant impact on the GB transmission network. And by significant, we mean it causes a cost of at least £10,000 to either National Grid or to Northern Powergrid to address issues on the transmission network. So this is over and above the work required to connect you to our network and to resolve any issues on our network. And we're obliged to ask National Grid for a Statement of Works if we think there's a possibility of it being the case that the 10K threshold would be exceeded. Now, we don't necessarily know on every site, so we generally have some sort of agreed threshold that we work with National Grid to determine at what point we would request a Statement of Works. So why do we need to talk to them? Well, this slide just gives you a bit of a feel for what's going on in the world. If you go back 10 years, the amount of distributed generation was, relatively speaking, small compared to the amount of generation connected to the transmission network. But we're in a position now where the net peak demand of the Northern Powergrid network is about 5.9 gigawatts, and we've currently got about 3.5 gigawatts of generation connected to our network already, and there's another 3.3 gigawatts of contracted generation customers who have accepted our connection offers are in the process of developing out. So you can see that in the not too distant future, theoretically, our peak demand could be met purely from the generation within our network. Now, whether that really happens depends on the technology types and the type of economic model that each generator has in terms of when they choose to generate and who they're backing off against. So some of our grid supply points already export power at certain times of the day, and we've got a couple where they even export power during the peak demand when our customers are using the most amount of power. And a good example of this is Saltholme GSP, which is just to the north of Middlesbrough, where the demand within the group is 94 megawatts, but the actual amount of generation operating is 110 megawatts, and there's 16 megawatts spilling out onto the transmission network. So, I might have pressed the wrong button there. I was just trying to find out what the results were from the poll that we ran before I carry on. And we've got a mixture, we've got a fairly even spread actually between people who are just trying to find more about statement of works, people who have been through the traditional process, and people who have got experience of the Appendix G process. It's almost a third each, so that's useful for us. We know that we've got to both satisfy the those people who know less and those people who've got experience elsewhere. Okay, so carrying on. So the statement of works process is a formal process for sharing the details of our contracted generation with National Grid so that they can assess whether that contracted generation causes any issues. That process, National Grid has to give us a statement within 28 days, and if there are no issues, then we can continue and connect our generators. However, if National Grid does identify there's an issue, then we have an obligation not to connect that generation until National Grid confirm that everything's okay to connect, which could be after we've completed some works or we've agreed some site-specific running conditions for the customer. So we have to make sure that the end customer is going to agree to those requirements. National Grid will make us an offer which includes those requirements, and if there's any work to do on the transmission network, we will also get a construction agreement which lays down the terms under which they'll carry out the work for us. Within those requirements, there could be an intertripping requirement or an operational restriction on the generator. The customer, the generator, then has a choice. They can either accept those liabilities or restrictions, or they have to choose, in effect, to cancel their scheme because they're not permitted to connect. So this doesn't apply to all generators. So all our grid supply points have a nominal statement of works threshold, and typically it's set at 50 megawatts, although with the issues on the transmission network that we're starting to see more prevalent in the Yorkshire and the North East, those thresholds are probably going to reduce. One or two sites we've already reduced them by agreement, and it includes all generation sites that are greater than a megawatt. If your overall site is less than a megawatt, then you are outside of the process and we don't need to go and ask National Grid. So generally, low voltage connected schemes are too small and aren't in the process. So how do we actually manage it? So Northern Powergrid tracks all the generation offers that we make that are greater than 1 megawatt. And if the cumulative contracted offers plus the live offers exceeds the threshold, then the offer that we make to the customer will include a clause that says they will need a statement of works as part of their overall connection requirements. However, we're making offers to customers and they may or may not accept them. So it is possible that someone in front of you in the queue decides not to accept their connection offer, and then the threshold is no longer exceeded, and you, even though we originally said you will need a statement of works, it's possible that that statement of works requirement will fall away once we know which other customers have accepted their offers as well. So sometimes sometimes you'll be told you need a statement of works, and then later on we'll be able to come back to you and confirm that actually it's okay. So what are the potential outcomes from a statement of works request? You can firstly end up with no works required. The impact of that is no impact, straight away get connected. If National Grid say works are required, we have to go into a second stage of the process, and that requires us to confirm to National Grid that you want to progress. So it's commonly known as a confirmation of progression, but it's also referred to as a modification application, or ModApp, people call it for short. And typically that process can take 3 to 6 months to resolve, so it can be quite time consuming under the traditional method. If you do go into modification, there's two potential outcomes. One is that works are required but can be managed, and you can connect subject to some conditions until those works are completed. But the second option is that works are required before you can connect, and your overall project may be delayed until those works are completed. So that's the traditional process, but also that we've been trying to develop nationally a better process that can speed things up for customers, because there's a recognition that the delays are not good for customers. So Appendix G, as it's called, is an addition to the connection agreements that we as Northern Powergrid have with National Grid. And we have one of these connection agreements for every grid supply point where we interface with the transmission network.
All right, David, we have got a question from Mark Degg, and he's just asking that he understand that the statement of works is automatically triggered at 20 megawatts in England and Wales. Is that correct?
Okay, so each network operator agrees with National Grid on a site-specific basis, so every grid supply point, what the threshold is within their networks. So it may be that you've had experience in another area where they've agreed with National Grid some triggers at 20 megawatts. That trigger can be anything from 1 megawatt upwards, and typically in the past it was set at 50 megawatts, but those numbers have been coming down depending on how tight things are in other areas. So it's not strictly correct to say it's 20 megawatts everywhere. It will depend on the local network and what the network operators agreed with National Grid. So the Appendix G process, is a way to try to improve the management of the connection of customers. So if we already know with National Grid that there are some site-specific requirements, it would be very time-consuming if you have to go and ask each time. So instead, if we can have an agreement with National Grid of what the requirements are, and we stay below another threshold, then we can make the offer to the customer when they get their quotation, including any National Grid requirements. And that way we speed up the process massively. But that doesn't always work, because sometimes we're still going to go over the threshold, and under those circumstances we have to go back to in effect do another statement of works. So which process is best? Well, the traditional statement of works process works well for single customer applications and for sites that are not very busy. Generally you get an answer within about 2 months, taking into consideration the timescales for the paperwork, but it can be as long as 11 months if works are required, once you add up all the time that you get as a customer to consider National Grid's position and National Grid gets to do their work. So it can be quite a long drawn out process, but works well on sites where there's not a lot going on. Where sites are particularly busy, or where there are known restrictions on the site, then the Appendix G process speeds things up massively and helps. So can be much slicker and is the place that we would move towards for any sites that have a reasonable level of activity. It does require us to provide monthly updates to National Grid as part of the process, so although we can sign customers off, we do have to keep a track and let National Grid know what's going on. Now, this new Appendix G process ideally should be covered under what's called CUSC, which is the Connection and Use of System Code, which is basically the commercial agreement that anyone who has a relationship with the transmission network through National Grid has to sign up to. And there's a working group to develop this Appendix G process into a formal process that would be consistent across the country. Unfortunately, that work has been rather slow. The team within National Grid who look after CUSC modifications have advised us that the priority of this particular change is relatively low, and therefore the work to get it formalised is slow, which is a bit disappointing. However, we're working with National Grid to try and get the right sort of outcomes in our area, and we're in the process at the moment of moving towards Appendix Gs across more of our sites, and I'll come on a little bit more onto that later on. So I think I'm going to come across and let Kazim now give you a bit of an update of where we've been active in terms of statement of works requests, and then we'll come back and tell you a little bit more about what we're trying to do to make it easier.
Thank you, David. You have very set the scene right in terms of statement of works, what are the requirements and what triggers it, what is the traditional approach, and how we are moving towards the Appendix G trial. And also, just to update, we have got questions coming in, and but some of the questions here will be addressed later in the presentation, because there's a separate part for the outcome of the ModApp in the second part, which is the second part of David's presentation. So let me introduce myself. My name is Kaisar Malik. I'm EHV Design Engineer in Northern Powergrid. So I'll be talking about the volumes of statement of works that we have progressed in past 16 to 18 months. So first of all, just a bit of a headline, who we are. We are Northern Powergrid, because I understand the people listening on the other side of this webinar, you may came across, different DNOs. So we are the DNO in the Yorkshire, Humber area up to Newcastle, Shiremore. So this slide on the screen just showing where we are and where we are as a DNO in England. So we have got two license areas. We have got Northeast license area and Yorkshire license area. So you can see on your screen there is a split between Yorkshire and license. Overall, we are Northern Powergrid. So altogether, we have got 40 grid supply points. We normally call them GSPs as a short, but grid supply points, we have got grid supply points are the locations where we have got interface between National Grid and us as a DNO. So we have got 17 GSPs in the Northeast license area, and we have got 23 GSPs in the Yorkshire license area. So this is just a bit of an overall picture of the 23 GSPs in the Yorkshire license area. I'm not going to go into the exact details of these GSPs, but these slides are in the public domain after this webinar, so you can have a look, and if you have got any schemes in this particular patch. And we have got the 17 GSPs in the Northeast license area. So moving on to the statement of works volumes. So we have progressed 22 statement of work requests in the past 16 months. So you can see on your screens, sorry. Yeah, so you can see on your screens the grid supply points where we have progressed with statement of works request in past 16 months. The 13 GSPs in Yorkshire patch and 9 GSPs in Northeast patch. So out of these 22 statement of works requests that we have progressed, we have gone into 12 modification applications. As a short, we call them mod apps. So the slide on the screen are showing the 7 GSPs that we have progressed to mod apps in the Yorkshire license area, and the 5 GSPs that we have progressed to mod app in the Northeast license area. As we are speaking now, we are at 3 GSP sites. We are in the statement of request now. We are progressing the statement of works. So, and I'm going to show you an overall picture of what we are doing and where we are in terms of the statement of works and mod app position. So you can see on your screens, we have got 40 GSPs altogether in Yorkshire and Northeast license areas. So we have completed the statement of work, as I mentioned earlier, which is, let me quickly see my notes. Yeah, 22 statement of work requests we have completed, 13 in Yorkshire, 9 in the Northeast license areas. That led to 12 modification applications, and currently we are in at 3 sites we are in the statement of work request. So the GSPs where there are no issues were identified as part of the statement of works are listed onto the slides, but just with a word of caution, this doesn't mean that there are no issues at present. I mean, there wouldn't be any issues in future, because as we will progress to the new statement of works or the mod apps, depending on the scenario, the technology of the generator at that time, there could be some issues. But at this moment of time, as we are speaking now, on the basis of the past statement of works, there are no issues were identified on these sites. So what are the key outcomes of the statement of works or the mod apps we have progressed up till now? So we have got 2 sites in our Yorkshire license area where we have got restrictions to connect, or I should say restriction to energize a generator till the reinforcement works on the GSP sites are completed. So what this means is any generator which is greater than 190 kilowatt cannot energize until the switchgear reinforcement works at the GSP site are completed. So these GSPs are Keadby and West Melton. So the slide is just showing the rough patch based on the postal code areas where the Keadby's grid supply point is feeding the network. So on Keadby, we have to reinforce the 132 kV switchgear because of fault levels, and also there is an A&M scheme is being proposed to implement. So till these works are completed, which is the switchgear upgrade works, and to manage the reverse power, the A&M scheme, no generator greater than 190 kilowatt can be energized. This doesn't mean that you cannot apply for a connection. You can apply for a connection that's going to be looked at on its merit, but you won't be, if you're going to accept that connection offer, you won't be able to energize your generator connection till these works are completed. So the West Melton patch is near Sheffield, which is, you can see on your screen that of idea where the West Melton and Thorpe Marsh GSP network is feeding. So West Melton at West Melton and Thorpe Marsh, we have got similar issues in terms of fault levels, and 132 kV switchgear upgrade is being proposed. The expected completion time is between 2022 and 23. So again, no generator greater than 190 kilowatt can be energized until these works are completed. So in terms of the key outcomes, there are 9 GSPs where there are no works identified. So these GSPs are listed on the screen. Sorry, thanks David, thanks for correcting me. There are 9 GSP sites where there are voltage issues identified on the National Grid transmission network. So this is basically as the outcome of the mod app, or where we are in the existing mod app process because of the voltage issues at the National Grid transmission site. So David's going to talk about it in the later part of the presentation and what this issue look like and what are the possible outcomes. Addition to that, we have got one GSP site where we have got specific National Grid restrictions, or you can call it constraints applicable, which is Salt and North GSP. So these constraints are applicable during certain transmission network outages conditions. David's going to talk about it. I think you have already talked about it in the Appendix G process where we have implemented the Appendix G process.
I've got a bit more on it, yeah.
Okay. So in terms of the summary of the GSP statement of works and mod app position, we have got 10 GSPs where no issues identified, 3 GSPs where reinforcement works are required before generator can be energized. We have got 9 GSPs with no work issues, with voltage issues, and 1 GSP with local transmission system constraints. So you can ask questions either during the presentation.
I've got a question for you.
All right. Okay.
Before we move on to my how do we resolve these things.
Thank you.
And this is a fair question. Clearly, one of our customers has asked, making the point that the delay between customers accepting and us getting to the statement of works process kicking off with National Grid has been quite substantial in some circumstances, which I absolutely know is true. So, we're not trying to hide away from that fact. But how are we getting on with that now in terms of what's our turnaround time like now in terms of getting to a statement of works once a customer has accepted?
Yeah, as I understand, there is no delay after the customer has accepted. But on some occasions, yes, customer, basically when they apply during the inquiry stage, the information is indicative. So during the first meetings, the customer do ask us to wait until they finalize their design before we move on submitting the statement of work. So if this delay is with reference to that, so I can understand this is delay from the customer, but there is, as I understand, there is no delay from us, from our side.
Now?
Yeah.
Yeah, because I think it is fair to say that this time last year we were way behind, and that's why we've got so many sites that have been through the process in the last 12, 18 months, because we had got behind, and I think it's a perfectly valid point. If you still think that you're suffering from that and that we're not progressing yours, then please come back to us, because we believe that we've got on top of that issue now. But this time last year, we were in a bit of a mess because the data requirements had changed significantly, and we hadn't really got on top of that. We have to submit a lot more detail to National Grid now as part of that process.
We have to take a bit of a study basically to submit the data that is required for the statement of works. And I understand your question, but if you have got a particular site where you want us to look at and where you think there is a delay, definitely we're going to be looking into it.
Yeah, if you've got some concerns.
All right, thank you.
Okay, so moving on. So solutions for statement of works. As Kaz has outlined, we've got 3 potential issues that come out of statement of works normally. One is fault level, due to the fault level contribution from the distributed generation in the network. The second one is to do with the reverse power flow at the grid supply points due to the amount of generation in our network being greater than the amount of demand at the time. And then the third point is about the voltage management issues on the transmission network, which is partly caused by the reactive power that's being exported from our network through the grid supply point. So fault level management, we already use where we can operational fault level management where it's feasible, and a lot of our grid supply points already operate in some split configurations where we have enough transformer capacity to still maintain security of supply to customers. But any operational solutions that we use, it is important that we don't impact on our capability to operate the network for planned maintenance outages and for faults, and that we don't affect significantly the security of supply to our end customers. So where we can't provide long-term solutions using those methods, then at the moment the only other tool in our toolbox is some sort of reinforcement, which can lead to significant delays for the generation that's trying to connect. That's the point where we've got to at Keadby and West Melton, where there isn't really another operational alternative solution, and we're having to replace the switchgear there. We are looking at ways to try to manage fault level. So A&M active network management is something that we use for thermal issues. At the moment we don't see it practically being applied for fault level, but we are planning to install some fault level monitors over the next 18 months so that we can compare our measured actual values on site with our theoretical values in our models, and then we can look at whether there is actually any scope for offering customers solutions that might allow them to connect when theoretically the fault level might be bust. So reverse power flow at GSPs, this is about, we have a number of transformers at the grid supply point that have a thermal rating, and as we go into reverse power flow, we've got to make sure that we don't overload those assets. Those assets are classed as transmission assets. We already make those assessments on our distribution networks, but we need to make sure we don't overload National Grid's assets either. Now, under normal running, this generally isn't an issue, but when we have planned outages in the summer, we can get into some situations where the theoretical reverse power could be too high, and we would need to constrain some customers. But generally, it's only if we have a planned outage followed by a fault, and we're left with maybe one transformer out of 3 or 2 out of 4, and they struggle to cope with the reverse power at certain times of day. So the solution that we're moving towards there is to install an active network management system, which we gave a webinar about a month ago, which tells you a little bit more about how we apply active network management. But generally speaking, it costs about £1 million to initially install. The incremental cost of adding customers to that scheme is significantly less than that, and that's compared to a typical cost of £10 to £15 million to add more transformer capacity at the GSP. So it's a relatively cheap way to solve the problem. And it's also addressing a situation that doesn't occur very often, so the likelihood of constraint for the end customer is relatively small. So the key area where we've been having quite a lot of discussion with National Grid is how we help them with the issue of high volts on the transmission network, which from our perspective is about managing the reactive power flows at the grid supply point. National Grid's original approach to us was that customers, new generation customers, would have the capability to operate across the power factor range of 0.95 lead to 0.95 lag, whereas our traditional operating range was 0.95 lag to unity, so without the leading power factor. The leading power factor for synchronous generation does cause us significant issues on the distribution network because the stability of the generators can be compromised, because generally speaking the smaller synchronous generators don't have enough inertia to keep themselves stable under fault conditions.
I think you have answered the Peter Imre's questions. Have National Grid asked for a generator to operate at a certain power factor as part of the request?
Yeah, okay, yeah. So National Grid, that was their approach to us. However, we weren't very happy with that approach, so we suggested some alternative solutions, and we've been working with them to make sure that we can not make matters worse for them on the transmission network. So we're looking for solutions where the reactive power flow, the exported reactive power at the grid supply point, is not increased as a result of a generator connecting to our network. And part of our solution is asking those generators to operate at or near to unity power factor. But we don't believe that those customers should be penalised and have to solve the problems that National Grid already has, which was in effect what they were going to try and get by the back door. Maybe I'll make that a bit harsh, but in effect they were asking for more than they needed. And we're saying, well, that's a bit unreasonable for our end customers. so we didn't want to go quite that far. We've also had a discussion about there is a potential scenario where if all of the distributed generation is operating, then the amount of generation on the transmission network directly connected that National Grid can control to balance the network and control the voltage can become too small. So there can, under some emergency conditions, be a requirement to temporarily disconnect generation on the distribution networks to maintain the stability of the whole GB network. And we are in the process at the moment of agreeing some words with National Grid about how we would do that and how we'd maintain control of that to give National Grid what it needs, but to make sure that our customers aren't switched off before other transmission customers, where it may be cheaper for National Grid to switch our customers off where there are no penalties versus paying a penalty to disconnect the transmission customer. So we're just trying to make sure that the interests of our customers are looked after there. So we're currently working with National Grid to get a set of words that we can put into our connection agreements at each of the GSPs. I'm just waiting for the slide to roll over, but it's gone a bit slow and I can't quite... oh, it's gone twice now. Go back one. Nearly there. Sorry about this.
All right.
Yeah, here we go. So we're working to try and agree those words and the terms between us and National Grid on active and reactive power contribution at the GSPs. And the idea is that we'll then be able to roll those words into all of the 9 GSPs that CAS has identified with potential voltage issues. There are a couple of other GSPs that we've been talking about as well to sort it out. And we expect that these words will be our standard set of words wherever we identify voltage issues on other GSPs in the future. We're also separately working with National Grid to try and address their voltage issues where we're looking to work with them. So if there is a cost-effective solution on the distribution network that's cheaper than doing something on the transmission network, then we would, in a whole system planning environment, consider carrying out those works. And the funding mechanisms associated with that will need to be agreed with Ofgem in the regulatory environment.
You've got a question from Mark Deck, and I think he's asking, is the management already included in the G99 control scheme? I understand this question is regarding stability studies or the stability of the generator that we do.
So there's a couple of things in G99 that are different to G59. So G99 requires generators to have the capability to do reactive power at 0.95 lead to 0.95 lag, or even 0.92 lead to lag, depending on the size of your generator. And there is a requirement to be able to have a signal from Northern Powergrid to the generator to reduce their output. So it's sort of partially covered. We've always required generators anyway to run at particular power factors, or we've given them a range. So I don't think it quite does it in G99, but the capability is there in G99. It's a case of putting appropriate control systems against that. But we were just trying to be careful that we're not imposing on customers requirements over and above what's really needed. That was the key thing for us in what we were looking for. Okay. So a quick summary of where we are then, and then we can go through to see if we've got any more questions. We have actually answered most of the questions, I think, as we've been going through the presentation. So reactive power and reverse power flow issues are becoming widespread at the transmission distribution interface. We are seeing more and more challenges about those levels. So we've been working with National Grid over the last 9 months to try and agree a standard set of measures so that we avoid making matters worse when we connect DG, but we also are not overburdening those generators with requirements over and above what's needed. We do think the Appendix G process will speed up how quickly we can make offers to customers, and we are disappointed that the official CUSC changes are not progressing as quickly as possible. We're trying to back off the risk associated with changes to the CUSC by making sure that if our process that we agree in the meantime is slightly different, is that we move to whatever the final arrangement is. But I think that from a customer impact perspective, that would be a very small change, if at all. So we are moving to Appendix G now, as and when sites come up and need that flexibility. So we're not just saying we're going Appendix G at all 40 grid supply points. We're doing it on a piecemeal basis, but we're recognising that even though the original trials weren't in our area, to wait for the CUSC modification to go through before we move to Appendix G would not be very beneficial to our customers. So that's one of the key reasons why we're moving on now. Okay, so opportunity now for you to ask us any additional questions. We've covered our formal content, but you might be sitting there thinking, well, there's something else I still want to ask you. So there's two things now. We'll just run a quick poll to find out whether today's webinar has helped you to improve your understanding of the statement of process and how we're managing the process. But also, if there's anything else that we can help with you on this, then please, please drop us a question now on the webinar, and we will attempt to answer your question now. If we can't answer your question, then we'll certainly take it away and come back to you individually. But also, there's the opportunity to give any feedback through the original email in the start of the webinar, which is ice@northernpowergrid.com. So that poll is running in the background.
We have got a question from Peter Imrie again, and Peter is asking, are you aware of the national grid threshold at NPG GSPs?
Okay, so what are the thresholds we're running with? Yeah, so we are currently still using, for most sites, the 50 megawatt threshold, and I should just point out that it is cumulatively applied. So if your project is 20 megawatts and you're okay, the next guy's 20 megawatts, he's okay. When the third guy comes along for 20 megawatts, he's the one who busts the threshold. It's just the third person who is on the hook for the statement of works. The first two people are okay, and they can still progress.
Yeah, I think Peter is asking, have you got specific threshold listed for the GSP in our patch?
Yeah, so I think we need to publish that, don't we? Because we know what they are.
Yeah, yeah.
So,
but this will be only an indicative position. It won't be like
correct.
That the customer can see where they stand in terms of statement of work.
Yeah. So that information is actually embedded in our heat maps. So in the heat maps, if you go to any substation, not necessarily the grid supply point, it will tell you how much spare capacity there is before we trigger the statement of works threshold. So if it's saying less than 1, then there's nothing left. But if we've used 40 of the 50, it will be saying there's 10 megawatts left. But I don't think it actually tells you what the threshold is. What the original threshold is. Yeah.
And also, when your generator is accepted, it is like an interactive position, so it may change when you come to the acceptance stage, and we may review if one of the generators is already gone. So you may be under the threshold later on when you have accepted or when you have progressed.
Correct. If someone ahead of you actually didn't accept or dropped out. So there's room for that. So we've got another question here, is how do I get a copy of the PowerPoint slides? Okay, so the presentation will be going up on the internet as a YouTube video rather than a slide set itself. I can have a chat with our ICE coordinator to see whether we can make the PowerPoint slide set available separate from the webinar. I don't know if we're doing that. We'll have to come back to you on that particular point. But I think you will all get, all the people who have signed in today will get a link to where the presentation goes up. Yeah. And obviously, if we do push it out as a PowerPoint, it would be a PDF rather than the actual PowerPoint itself.
There was one question I think we missed from Jacob, and could a reasonable expectations be established between both parties, i.e. starting upfront the statement of works? I think he's asking, can we start the statement of works upfront? I'm not sure whether he's asking before the acceptance of the project or just soon after the acceptance of the project.
Okay. So our current position is we wouldn't normally do a statement of works request until someone accepts our offer. But what we should be able to do is give a customer our best view of where we think that's going to go. So we generally are finding now at virtually every site, although we have 9 sites that it was less than 9 actually, I can't remember how many it was now, that didn't have any triggered works. We think if we went back to those sites today, National Grid would come back and say we've got voltage issues. So there are things that we can anticipate and share, which would hopefully help customers to understand the likely outcome. There has been discussion about going for statement of works. I'm involved in the CUSC working group, and within there have been discussions about customers who would like a statement of works before they've actually applied, and whether we can find a way of doing that. So it's under consideration, but I don't know whether we'll actually get to a point where that will become a formal process, because ultimately the customer wouldn't be able to accept a modification without accepting a connection offer as well. So, and how do you queue manage between the customer who's trying to get that early information versus the customer who just applies direct? So I think there's a bit of work to be done in that area before it can be applied. But certainly the point about that we should have an internal target of how quickly we move to the statement of works from acceptance is perfectly valid. In actual fact, the CUSC process says that we should do it immediately, so strictly speaking there shouldn't be any delay. There is certainly a few weeks' work to actually do the studies and present the data to National Grid, so I would expect it to take about a month if you hit the ground running. So I think there's a suggestion in one of the questions that maybe 2 months from acceptance is a reasonable target, and I would tend to agree that that sort of time scale is reasonable. The only thing I would say is some customers accept their connection offer but don't make their initial payment, and we don't consider that to be a contractually binding acceptance until the customer's made their first payment. So if the customer's made their first payment, we've got no excuse. But if they haven't, then I don't think we would progress it until that payment comes through.
David, just a question related to Jacob's question. What will happen if there are multiple customers and one of them is keen to progress and the other one is not very keen to progress?
Yes, okay. So yes, we have had that scenario before where customer number 1 is keen to go, or it could be customer number 2 actually.
Yeah.
And customer number 1 isn't so keen, and the way we've resolved that in the past is to say to the customer who is less keen is, look, we're going now. If you don't come with us, then you're going to face significant delays because your project won't have been considered and will still need consideration. And we would factor into that as well, how it fits into their overall delivery timescale. So some customers have been known to use the statement of works and stability studies as a way to defer progression of their project while they're maybe considering whether they get a contract and things like that. And we're very conscious of the fact that we're not going to hold back other customers due to those sorts of circumstances.
All right, we have got another question.
Oops, hang on. Yeah.
It's again related to the statement of works. And from Mark Degg asking, statement of works is an issue in that we accepted a scheme in another region and post-acceptance the statement of works came in at 500k, which is an issue for funders. I think he's talking about the mod app. Because
the cost of the works of the mod offer. Yeah. So that is always a risk. I mean, this is part of the reason for moving to Appendix G. Is if we already know what the works are, then we can tell the customer that in the original connection offer. But currently, if you go into the statement of works process, you could be on the hook for some significant cost. So if we are having to replace switchgear due to fault level, although strictly speaking the Northern Powergrid equipment will have apportionment applied to it, which could limit your liabilities, the charging methodologies say that the national grid costs are not apportioned. So given that a 132 kV circuit breaker bay at a grid supply point could cost £1 million to replace, if there are 2, 3 or 4 of those circuit breakers need to be done that are national grids, that could be theoretically a bill for a single end customer of up to £4 million, which would sink a lot of projects. So it is, being aware of whether there are fault level issue in the network is a really important part. And active network management, again, it's got a reasonably high initial setup cost of about £1 million. That is generally customer funded, so if it's one customer needing that can be a large bill. When it's across multiple customers, it's less painful, but you may not be in that situation. You could be that single customer that has taken something over a threshold and requires that work. So yes, I think that is a real concern for developers, that they want to know that statement of works response as early as possible so that they can understand and build it into their economic model and check whether their projects are still financially viable.
Thanks, David. You have very good explained what are the outcomes. The second part of the question is also not clear on the non-progression fees. This cash lost but refunded on progression.
Okay, so when you if you sign up to a set of liabilities, then there is an immediate cost if you then cancel after you've signed. So when you go into the statement of works process, at that point you haven't committed to the costs of any transmission works. But if you sign the next bit after we've had our modification offer, then you are liable for cancellation. Now, under certain circumstances, you may pay that and you might get your money back if National Grid deem that the works need to go ahead anyway. But a lot of customers opt for a liability that's on a pounds per megawatt basis, and if you cancel after you've signed up, then you would lose that money, and that's the way that National Grid funds the risk associated with customers backing off after National Grid is committed to carrying out transmission reinforcement works. So, these contracts shouldn't be signed lightly, and theoretically, National Grid's works can change, and so the costs can change. But generally speaking, that's less of a risk. We are managing it as closely as we can to agree the works that are required. So there is some scope for unknown costs always, but generally managed within the budget that we expect at the beginning. But yeah, it is a risk signing up for those works, and hence you can see why, where possible, we're trying to agree with National Grid solutions that are more about customer operating regimes rather than actually triggering the reinforcement works on the transmission network. That reduces the customer's cost liabilities massively. But at the same time, we don't want to lose flexibility of the operation of our network, which is why we are trying to agree with National Grid terms that allow us to manage the end customers rather than National Grid dictating exactly how they should operate.
All right, thank you, David. You well answered this question. I think we have got polls ready.
Okay, so I think we have answered all the questions that have come in. In terms of the poll, let's have a look. If if I can find the results. So it's reassuring to know that people have found the webinar useful, and everyone who responded has said that they found it useful. So thank you very much for that. But if you have got any other burning questions, please do. We're going to close the actual webinar down now. But if you have got any questions, please do contact us and through the ICE email address, and we will endeavour to answer your queries, whether they're an individual personal one or a general one. Okay, so thanks, Kaza, for your help, and thank you everyone for listening, and goodbye.
All right, thank you. Goodbye.